Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, the Pennsylvania Medical Society joins me this week, but first, the upcoming state budget and guns in school. We'll get to those topics and more after these words.
Welcome to the fast-paced and unrehearsed weekly discussion featuring the leaders who help shape your world. Join us as we address the issues that impact you each and every day. This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
All right, joining me as often is the case is two reporters who cover all things involving Pennsylvania politics and government. Charlie Thompson, he's with the Harrisburg Patriot News and PennLive, and of course, Marc Levy with the Associated Press. All right, Mark, here we go. Something like $44 billion is about to be appropriated by the Pennsylvania legislature, hopefully in conjunction with Governor Wolf before the magic date, June 30. So tell our viewers what's important in this budget. I mean, it's all important, but what are the more significant aspects of it?
Right. So it's the last 2 weeks of the fiscal year. It's the busiest 2 weeks of the year for the legislature, when all sorts of things get horse traded behind closed doors and tied to the budget. And this year, the governor's proposed a $43.7 billion general fund budget. Whatever passes won't be that big. It'll be a little bit less, most likely. But there are probably two or three key elements to it from the governor's perspective. One is a large increase for public schools. Republicans who control the legislature are on board with some sort of increase of public schools, but not to the extent that the governor has asked for. He's wanted about $1.8 billion all in for school operations, right, special education. Another item on the table, which has been on the table as long as the governor's been in office, is cutting the corporate net income tax. It's 9.99%. It's one of the highest in the nation, and it's for a generation. It's been talked about as being too high and frustrating economic growth in Pennsylvania, which is essentially a sluggish economic
And there's
state.
agreement in a general sense to reduce the corporate net income tax, but it's the percentages and how quickly it could occur. Am I right about that?
It's also the governor's insistence on some element of cracking down on tax avoidance. There's long been a perception that companies, particularly out-of-state companies, are adept at avoiding paying it by moving money through internal procedures. So small businesses that are partnerships don't pay it. They pay the personal income tax, which is about 3%. So that's where the rub is to what extent Republicans and business groups are willing to sign on to some sort of compromise on cracking down on tax avoidance. Yeah. So whatever happens, if we reduce the rate, it will cost the state money. Every estimate that we've seen from budget makers is that this will cost the state money. The hope is that it will improve the economic climate in Pennsylvania. Yeah. One of the big item that the governor has is he's been seeking a $200 million scholarship program for the state university system to kind of help get more students there. The system is shrinking. It's going through some changes.
Charlie, if there's some items you want to talk about, please do. It looks like this should be done on time. Typically, it's the problem that there isn't enough revenue to cover what lawmakers want to do, right?
It's a different universe over there this year because, it feels like maybe about once in a generation you have one of these budgets where, for different circumstances, they're flush with cash, and the revenue projections for this current fiscal year, revenue coming in has dramatically exceeded the projections, and they still have this huge nest egg of American Rescue Plan Act funds that are lying in the balance. So what are the estimates? That they have maybe approaching 10, maybe even more than $10 billion in excess funds.
Yeah, the Speaker of the House was on last week, and he said about $10 billion.
Yeah, which, this legislature puts great stock in fiscal responsibility. So we know that they're not going to spend all that at once, and they'll be very careful about making sure there's a buffer for what they would now probably presume would be a recession in the near future and that sort of thing.
Good point.
So they'll be careful, but the point is they do have resources to do some things this year, and maybe that will help ease an agreement.
And that is that's putting things on the table that have not been on the table for years.
One of the things the speaker said is they do not want to put lots of money in expenses that will reoccur. In other words, they want it once and done, not something that will require additional revenues over the years.
Right. So what they have this year is about $2 billion in unspent federal coronavirus aid. And what they're looking to do is to spend all that money, come to an agreement this month to appropriate all of it, just get it out. The deadline to spend it is the end of 2024, set by the federal government. But they want to go towards one-time things, capital needs, state parks, helping water and sewer upgrades, things like that, not to have sort of what they call a fiscal cliff when the money ends and you still have these recurring expenses.
Right. All right, given the horrific shooting that took place in a Texas school, we're going to have to talk about guns and what's going to happen in the Pennsylvania legislature with dealing with the issue of guns, and particularly in schools. We'll get to that after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
All right, Charlie Thompson, since that horrific shooting in a Texas school, there's been lots of discussion about guns all over the country as well as in Congress. I'm talking about in state legislatures. And in Pennsylvania, that debate has also come up, particularly about arming school personnel.
Yeah. As a spinoff to the gun control / school safety debate, our freshly minted Republican nominee for governor, State Senator Doug Mastriano, has dropped a co-sponsorship memo that would give school districts the option of allowing their professional staff, educators, guidance counselors, principals, to carry or have a firearm, have a gun in their class or in their office at a school if they have a concealed carry permit and are otherwise familiar with and allowed to carry a weapon like that.
And they'd have to have all sorts of training, I would presume, before that would be permitted, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that would still have to be worked out if this law goes anywhere. That's the rub. I mean, the teachers union has already come out against it, saying, well, let's just have school resource officers, aka police officers in schools, and let the teachers focus on teaching, because the counter argument is, if Mastriano's theory is good guys with guns can stop a bad guy with a gun, but the counter argument is, well, if you have somebody, different people with guns, how are the responding police supposed to know who's the good guy and the bad guy? If there's a raging gun battle going on in the school already. And they say, just let the teachers teach and let security professionals who the school district may or may not hire
Mark,
handle that.
What sort of surprises me is that there are all kinds, and we've talked about this before, there are retired police officers, retired military folks who, could be used to supply protection in the schools. And that ought to be, it seems to me, the logical first step to take, because they understand firearms, they could be there as an important resource. Is there any I haven't heard any discussion about that.
What we haven't heard discussion about necessarily is funding that specifically in schools. There have been, after Sandy Hook, the school shooting in Connecticut in 2012, the state started sending much more money to school safety, and schools were able to use it for purposes like that, for security purposes. That money has sort of tailed off over the years, but this argument about arming teachers has happened in Pennsylvania before, and the bill's gone nowhere, and the governor's opposed it before. But it coincides with Democrats trying to force votes on more traditional gun control bills, and those are going nowhere in this legislature, this Republican-controlled legislature.
Well, go ahead, Charlie.
Yeah, well, what I was just going to say, and I mean, yeah, it is kind of lather, rinse, repeat in the sense that, like, the Democrats are traditionally proposing gun control measures, and Republicans are more like, well, there's other ways we can address school safety without infringing on gun owners' rights. But, and meanwhile, the backdrop to all this in Harrisburg is that in Washington, there finally appears to be some movement towards baby steps in new gun legislation. I think
mental health resources, red flag laws, as they're called.
Well, incentives, a financial incentive for states to pass red flag laws, which Pennsylvania does not have.
Right. And
then thirdly, I read an analysis that where this might have some impact on some of the school shootings, or some of the mass shootings, I should say, and that is they want to raise the age limit for purchase of an assault rifle from 18 to 21, make that a federal law.
As always, I want to thank you for coming in. All right, an important topic with the Pennsylvania Medical Society, and that's coming up.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by
Cross-State Credit Union Association. Credit unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, go to ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
Joining me now is Dr. Wilson Jackson. He is the president-elect of the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Dr. Jackson, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate you the invitation.
Oh, my pleasure. Well, look, we're going to talk about something that we don't often deal with on the program, but obviously the Medical Society deals with it. It's called venue shopping, and that gets complicated because there are many sides to it. And one side that we don't often hear much about is the effect that venue shopping has on patients, on individuals who need medical care. First of all, for our viewers, what's venue shopping?
Venue shopping is kind of a legal term whereby a case can be moved to a jurisdiction that presumably would be provide a more favorable verdict in a case. In the situation for medicine, it has to do with malpractice cases. So venue shopping, there might be an accusation of a malpractice case in one county, say Dauphin County or Cumberland County, but the litigating lawyer will try to move that to a more favorable venue or more favorable county, such as Philadelphia or Pittsburgh County, which may have no connection whatsoever with the case itself where the case may have happened. So it's basically moving to a more favorable area with the more predictable, more favorable jury verdicts.
Yeah, and this can make a case go on for, I won't say months, even years.
It can get really, really drawn out, which is, as a practicing physician, I can just, talking with my colleagues, share with just the stress and strain of a malpractice case to begin with is significant, but having to add a travel component to that, let's say you're driving from Erie down to Pittsburgh or from Scranton down to Philadelphia. I mean, that's a substantial amount of time commitment, and these things get stretched out for years at a time.
Yeah, how common is this? Is it rare? Is it, infrequent, frequent? Can you make an estimate, or is that a difficult question to answer?
It's a fair question. And, my observation, having been in practice for over 20 years, is that there's an ebb and flow to these events, that there are times when there's a rise in these malpractice claims, and then they kind of fade down. And, back in the early 2000s, Pennsylvania saw a substantial rise in these verdicts in these cases, some of which in the physician community felt were somewhat frivolous. Certainly there needs to be a mechanism by which patients can be properly kind of compensated, but there was at times a kind of an abuse of the system and the process.
Sure. Well, let's talk about two aspects of it. One is the impact that it has on healthcare in general, and then after that, let's talk about the impact on patients directly. Let's go to the general.
Sure.
How does that impact healthcare?
Yeah, it'll come as no surprise to your listeners that healthcare is under considerable strain and stress, not just in Pennsylvania but throughout the country. We're still trying to navigate our way through the COVID crisis. That initial pandemic, the eruption and the demand on care, and the strain it put on the hospitals, particularly in the state of Pennsylvania. Secondly, what has followed in that is staffing shortages. It is really significantly difficult and challenging to get adequate staffing in the hospitals. And the third is what we call physician burnout. When you take a temperature of the physicians in our country, including our Commonwealth, physicians are feeling the strain of these events, and there's a certain component of burnout out there, which has generated some early retirements. So the impact of venue shopping is just yet another strain and stress on an already stressed kind of part of our economy and part of our healthcare system.
All right, we're going to run to a break. When we come back, I want to get to that second question I asked about how it impacts patients directly.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine.
We're back. I'm talking with Dr. Wilson Jackson. He's the president-elect of the Pennsylvania Medical Society. We're talking about venue shopping. And doctor, look, it has an impact on patients directly. Take it.
Yeah, it does. At the end of the day, physicians need to buy malpractice coverage. They're paying a premium. And that premium rises up and up, that adds additional strain and has kind of pushed some physicians to do a couple of things to react to that. One is simply retire. They just stop practicing. The second is to limit the scope of what they practice. So when we had this crisis back in 2003, many obstetricians, because of the high premium costs of delivering babies, simply stopped delivering babies. They just said, well, that's fine. I'll just eliminate that risk and therefore pay a lower premium. And as a result, parts of our state, pregnant women going into labor had to drive an exorbitant distance of time in order to deliver their babies. Same thing can happen. Orthopedic surgeons might decide they want to stop doing the more complicated back surgery just because of the higher premiums they're facing, and they'll just scale back their practice and stop doing that. Same with neurosurgeons. They'll scale back the more higher risk procedures. And what's forcing patients is having to travel further to get high level care because of those premiums. There's also kind of another impact beyond just physicians who are currently practicing, but that's physician recruitment. It's a small world when residents are looking for where to find employment when they finish their training, their residency and fellowships. If Pennsylvania gets a reputation as a high premium, high cost, high malpractice state, they're simply going to look at other states and just simply not move to Pennsylvania to practice. We're in a physician shortage throughout the country. We certainly don't want Pennsylvania to be top of that list. So both for practicing physicians choosing their scope of their care, and then recruiting kind of the young physicians coming into the country or into the state rather, we need to create a favorable environment where they want to come here and practice.
Yeah, it just adds to that. you know, if you don't have a life-threatening injury of some kind, you know, you can call a physician, and I do so regularly, my physicians, and, well, we'll give you an appointment in a month or 6 weeks or 7 weeks. That's how crowded these offices are when you go into them. And so what you're saying is this just adds to that problem that now exists. Is there, generally speaking, a shortage of specialists in our state and in America as well?
Yeah, there are. I mean, there's a couple drivers to that. Primary care is the first and foremost most important. I mean, our primary care colleagues, are critical gatekeepers to the whole healthcare system. They're responsible for coordinating a great deal of care. Just access to primary care is just a core need in the state and the country, for that matter. But also higher level care. In the state of Pennsylvania, we're blessed to have some really super outstanding research facilities with very high level care, both concentrated primarily in our metropolitan areas, but just super high level care. And we want to be able to maintain that. And these are also training places for the residents and the fellows learning these higher end skills. We want to create an environment where they're attracted to come and stay back in the state where they do their training.
Yeah, that's a good point. The other aspect of this is, what kind of impact does this have on new physicians that graduate, let's say, from Pennsylvania residency programs?
Yeah, back in 2003, there were studies done where at that point, the malpractice premiums are rising very, very highly. And, the residents just voted with their feet. They say, well, I'm graduating, I need to look for a job. Or a fellow coming out of a fellowship training said, I'm graduating, I need to look for a job. They just went elsewhere. They left the state. So despite having a state that has a high number of medical training facilities, both medical schools and residencies, we were not, back in 2003, we were not able to retain those high-level trained physicians coming out of their training programs. We don't want to see the same thing happen again. I mean, that put a tremendous strain on the system back in 2003, and we don't want to replicate that. So that's part of the intent of hoping to create a policy by way of the bylaws amendments for the state to avoid the venue shopping from happening and impacting malpractice premiums that it would impact patients.
We have about a minute left. Are there any changes that you have concern with to venue shopping, legal changes?
Yeah, so certainly, patients are entitled for compensation in cases of appropriately tried malpractice cases. I mean, there's no question on that. But my feeling is that it should be a review by their peers. And is the case happen in, say, Cumberland County, their peers are not necessarily those that might be representing a jury in Philadelphia County. And I'm just calling out those two counties just as an illustration. So we do believe there should be an evaluation by their peers I'm not a lawyer and I don't understand the nuances necessarily of peer review, but I do understand we want to create a fair playing field for the physicians to defend themselves in these malpractice cases.
Well, look, I want to thank you for coming on and providing this update, and we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, stay well.